I'm feeling a bit stupid right now.
Well, don't worry about it. Just carry on.
Well, start afresh.
Good luck.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see my slide. You should see my slide now. Can you confirm?
It's good.
Okay. Yeah, here I go again, but for you it's the first time, of course. We're going to talk about rejuvenating your Oracle systems, and you can do so at any point in time, of course. But many organizations realize that now we are entering a cloudy world, and that might be a good time to do this rejuvenation exploration. And we've come up with the term 6R for that. 6R for reinventing, but first reassessing your systems. And I'm going to talk about what 6R is and how it applies to Oracle systems and, of course, also to Oracle Cloud. Let me use a few words to introduce myself. My name is Lucas Jellema. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've probably met some of you in the past, either at auditor conferences or maybe at Oracle Open World. I'm the CTO for AMIS, which is a member of the Conclusion ecosystem, a company in the Netherlands. And I go to customers, and then I will call myself a cloud solution architect or solution architect or data architect or whatever fits the bill, any sort of architect. Of course, I'm also a developer. I bring 27 years of professional Oracle experience. I started out professional life at Oracle in '94, spent 8 years over there, and then moved to AMIS. I'm still very much associated with Oracle through the Groundbreaker Ambassador program and the Oracle ACE program. And I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about a customer of mine, and I started working with them about 1.5 years ago. Their story is a typical story in the sense that it's the story for many organizations, maybe at a slightly different scale. Basically, many organizations are in the same situation and want to make the same move. So it's a Dutch company, and they have an on-premises data center. It's not on their premises, it's actually in Germany. And in that data center, they have their own hardware. They run their infrastructure on that hardware. Well, hardware is part of the infrastructure, but they also run additional infrastructure. They run databases, applications. They operate some of it themselves, but most of the operations have been outsourced. And they have some issues with their IT environment. And some of them are listed on the slide. And most of the words on the slides probably are somewhat familiar to you, or maybe apply very much to the situation that you have to deal with day to day. Business thinks it's all inflexible and it's very expensive and it's old and it's legacy, and legacy is not a good thing in this case. And you probably are aware that the technology stack you're using is not highly attractive to young talent, and it's very hard to keep up with the business desires, and it's very hard to further scale the applications. It's hard to do any sort of evolution technology-wise. The business won't pay for it, won't wait for it, but also technical lifecycle management is not necessarily a forte of most of the teams in your organization, or at least in this organization. And Oracle is at the center of everything. That's because 25 years ago, the organization started building its IT landscape, started building its applications, started creating a real competitive edge in their market using Oracle technology, using Oracle database, using PL SQL, obviously, using Oracle Forms. And they were extremely happy at that time with that technology. They didn't really keep on refreshing their technology stack. They did database upgrades. Their upgrade to Oracle Database 12.1 happened 2 years ago. Before that, they were still on 10, and maybe some 9 mixed in as well. So they are moving, but they are moving fairly slowly. And they are, as we speak, phasing out their last Oracle Forms 4.5 applications, client server. 4.5 only comes client server. That's really old. So this is their situation. And they want to turn it into a fairy tale. So once upon a time for them is about now. And they've been hearing all these cloud promises. And if you go to the cloud, the sun will shine and everything will be resolved. You will always have the latest and greatest technology stack. And you don't have to do anything for that. And you will be able to do very rapid innovation because everything is available in the cloud. You can switch it on and start going. And you will pay only for what you use. You don't have to invest anything, certainly not upfront. You will just use things, they will give you a value, and a little bit of that value has to be paid for the use of the cloud resources. Thereby, you will lower your total cost of ownership. And everything will be super secure because, well, the cloud vendor has people who know so much about security that they can do it in a much more secure way than you can do yourself. Everything is fully managed. You only have to think what you want and it will happen. The scalability of the cloud is limitless, endless resources and data centers across the world. The sky is the limit. And that's where the clouds are, of course. And everything happens in an automated fashion. No manual activities. You say what you want to have happened and it's done automatically for you. It's like the promise that we give to our end users with their business functionality, and our business functionality is getting access to cloud resources. And you will have very fine-grained cost control. And to me, that's quite important because that allows me to specify or analyze exactly which applications, which business features, which business units run up which costs, and which application that perhaps no one is using at all cause certain costs. And basically, the cloud promises include the moon. You will get everything. Of course, we all know that's not entirely true, and it's certainly not true that you can get it without any effort and without any risk. And this organization was well aware, but they wanted to explore. And they brought me in, along with many other people, to help them explore. Because for them, the once upon a time of the cloud's fairy tale is about now. This is the starting situation, and I think I discussed most of that. Also, the fact that they are unhappy with the current IT and they want to start moving towards the future, a brighter future. They have embarked on a cloud transformation. They've initiated this big program, and their cloud, their preferred cloud, is blue. It's Azure, Microsoft Azure. Near the end of my story, I will tell you how Oracle Cloud also made its way into their roadmap. So it's no longer only Azure. And from the beginning, they expected to have a hybrid environment, and hybrid means things running on the cloud as well as things running on premises. They also expected a multi-cloud landscape with things running in one cloud, vendor's cloud, and other things running in another vendor's cloud, and the necessity to have close working relationships between the things running in these multi-clouds. It will come as no surprise that the cloud interconnect that exists between Oracle Cloud Infrastructure and Azure is a major linking pin that allows a multi-cloud setup with both Oracle Cloud and Azure. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. So cloud is where they want to go, but you probably realize that you can go to the cloud in many different ways. One of the ways, by the way, is not going there after all, because some things are simply not suitable for the cloud. But even if you take things to the cloud, you can do so in different ways, in 6 ways, hence the 6R method. Before I'm going to talk about the different ways, let's talk a little bit about cloud terminology that I will be using, that you probably are familiar with, at least to some extent, just to make sure that we're all on the same level. Infrastructure as a service. It provides you with the latest infrastructure, and infrastructure is compute services and storage services and networking services. The most basic, the most generic elements that you get in a virtual data center. and you get it in a programmable way. You probably have heard the term infrastructure as code, and this basically means that you can describe what infrastructure you need, which virtual machines, which firewall settings, which storage components, and how they are interconnected. You can define all of that as code. And then you can have this code executed to automatically provision the resources that you have defined. So that's the automation part. Infrastructure as a service typically comes with scalability options, elastic options to scale up, which means creating larger resources, ideally on the fly without having to bring them down, and also scale out. Add additional resources of the same type that can share part of the burden of the original resources. Infrastructure as a service supposedly is secure, takes care of much of the security, for example, in your network connection, and also the accessibility of your resources. Infrastructure as a service will typically be distributed, so you will have the option to fail over from one set of resources to another set of resources within the same data center, or even across data centers that can be located closely together, or even across data centers that are in different geographic regions. As with all cloud services, you pay per use and you have extremely rapid takeoff. You can have your own server running in a few minutes' time. And that is true, by the way. Most of what's on this list is true. How much you benefit, how easy it is to use, that might differ per use case. Another term you must have heard in discussions about the cloud is PaaS, or Platform as a Service. It discusses fully managed platform services, and platform is a tier above infrastructure, where infrastructure is extremely generic. It's compute. You can run Linux applications or Windows applications, and you can store data without having to say what type of data or what format of data. At the platform level, we're talking about platform components such as a database or a load balancer or an API gateway or a cache or an application server. So here we're talking about platform components that have specific functions that provide specific facilities to your applications. These platform services are typically more specific and specifically configured for your use case. So they are less generic than the infrastructure as a service. They add more value, and typically they will be more expensive as well. And managing them is a more specialty job. Your Oracle Autonomous Database Service is a perfect example of such a managed platform service. As with infrastructure as a service, you have instant ramp up. You can just switch on a platform service. It may take a few minutes to provision, but then it's available to you. So you don't have to buy the hardware, you don't have to install the hardware, you don't have to buy the software, install the software, as we were used to doing only a few years ago, or maybe still. You get promises of high availability, which you can manage, but it may take some configuration and some additional cost. Always the latest and greatest platform functionality. You will never be a few releases behind with your database platform, for example. That's the idea. It also restricts your freedom, by the way, but maybe that's the kind of freedom that you would like to have restricted. Again, dynamic scalability, elasticity as it's called. It frequently comes in a serverless fashion, meaning that you are not even aware, so you don't have to think about the underlying compute infrastructure services that's needed to run your platform, which is convenient, because why would you want to know about compute services and network settings if all you want is a database or an application server? One of the nice things about the cloud is that you get enterprise-grade services, so enterprise databases, enterprise application service, API gateways, available for anyone. Since you pay per use, if you use a little, you pay a little, so even startups can afford the kind of software that in the past was only available to large corporations. This is sometimes called democratization of IT, provided by the cloud. I like that very much. A typical PaaS environment will provide out-of-the-box facilities for monitoring, for logging, for the automation I mentioned, for security, for auditing, for handling events, for publishing events that you can then respond to, and it all comes out of the box. And frequently, it doesn't require additional costs to be paid. Then the highest level in the cloud that we typically discuss is SaaS, or software as a service. It replaces the commercial off the shelf. So now it's commercial of the cloud. That's the COTC. Again, fully managed. It comes with full functionality. If you want to have your CRM application or your general ledger or your supply chain management application, that's what SaaS will offer you. Something that you don't have to develop yourself because it has already been developed for you. You can just start using it. And of course, with SaaS applications, the added value of an IT department is fairly small. The vendor of the SaaS application provides the business functionality. What's left for us IT people? Well, of course, a SaaS application is never complete, so it needs to be extended. And it doesn't exist in isolation, and data needs to be exchanged. So integration is typically an important part of SaaS implementations. Well, we all know that there are several clouds around. AWS, Azure, Oracle Cloud, Google Cloud, and there are more. And most of the vendors, including Oracle, allow you to also to run the cloud on premises. That may sound a little bit strange. Why would you want to run a cloud on premises? Well, the idea is that on premises you have very low latency, and on premises you have physical access to your data, and you also can provide your own physical protection to your data. And even cloud representatives cannot enter the physical location, at least without your assent. In some countries, the internet facilities do not allow use of a remote cloud, or the regulations do not allow it. Some of the things that you need to consider when thinking about a cloud-based design, it's the vendor lock-in that you may be getting yourself into if you use vendor-specific services, especially at PaaS and SaaS level. That comes into play. You have to think about the network latency between your premises and wherever the cloud is located. That might be a big differentiator between cloud vendors. It might also be an inhibiting factor for moving things to the cloud. You have to think about cost for moving data out of the cloud. Most cloud vendors make ingress, so moving data into the cloud, free, but make you pay a fairly hefty sum for moving data out of the cloud. So look very carefully at your use case, how much data will be moved around. And there also, of course, think about the physical location of the cloud. Which data centers can you use? Are you allowed to use? And can you use based on the latency considerations? And think about which vendors you would like to enter into a strategic relationship with, based on your own experiences, maybe based on references from others. So when you start thinking about the cloud, it should give you pause. It gives you a moment to reflect. And reflection is always good, and we don't reflect enough, I think. So when considering the cloud, please take a moment to reflect. To reflect on your current IT landscape, reflect on what you actually want to achieve, about what your problems have been in the past, what your ideas for resolving it have been. Don't just get into the cloud really without thinking. So all these R's are still not the 6R model, but take a moment to consider. So let's now then talk about 6R. And I haven't invented 6R. It's probably invented by Gartner. I'm not even sure. Maybe by one of the other analysts or consultancy firms, but has been adopted fairly widely as a structured way of considering cloud migration, or not cloud migration, because that can be also an outcome. 6R is typically not just done for everything you have in one big bag, but it's discussed at a level per system. Could be per database or typically per application. So basically, this is what 6R looks like. 6 different arrows that all illustrate some migration path for a system or application. And we go into individual R's of the 6R model. And the first one, it's the easiest one, or at least it looks like the easiest one, it's retire. When you take your time to reflect, you will analyze your existing systems and applications, and you will find that some of them do no longer serve a purpose. Maybe no one's using it, or people are still using it, but it's certainly not adding the value required to justify the costs. So you have to come up with a way to retire it, decommission it. And of course, that's much cheaper than keeping it on and then migrating it to the cloud. May sound like an obvious thing, but this is something we should really be doing all the time, reassessing whether the applications and their features are still in use, and even if they are still really all that useful. Second option is to retain your systems. Retain them on premises, do not move them to the cloud, but perhaps refurbish them. Refurbish is an R, but it could mean upgrade, for example. Do proper lifecycle management, fix the problems you have, but do not fix them by moving things to the cloud, because that may not resolve your problem, or may be far too hard to do, or at least hard to do right now. Then go to the cloud, but in the easiest way possible. Rehost and perhaps refurbish. It basically means take an existing system, take an existing application, move it to the cloud, but only use generic cloud resources. Run it on a cloud compute facility, a virtual machine, instead of a virtual machine in your on-premises data center. It's easy to do. It's maybe frequently the first thing organization will do with an application. Of course, it only buys you limited value. If your hardware can no longer be used for whatever reason, then this is an easy way to get new hardware without having to buy new hardware. So there are certainly situations where this makes perfect sense. Sometimes it's called lift and shift, and Oracle has now trying to use the phrase move and improve, but the improve doesn't happen automatically. You have to go further into the cloud stack, or you have to make very serious work of refurbishment in order to actually get any improvement. So this is basically run your systems the way they are today, but run them on the cloud. And you don't have to manage your own infrastructure, your own physical infrastructure and hardware. You don't have to invest in any new hardware. So you gain some value, but not as much as there is to be gained in the cloud. The next level up is re-platform. Lift, tinker a bit, and shift. So you take your existing systems, you bring them to the cloud. You don't change the application as such, but you may change the platform on which it's running. So it's running on an Oracle database on premises, and you move it to Oracle Autonomous Database, for example, to benefit from the advantages of that platform. But you can do so without having to change your application. So the risk is lower, the effort is lower, and you still gain advantages. In this case, you don't have to manage your database platform. Maybe some management, but not all that much. The same goes for managed integration platforms, managed application server platforms, etc. The next level up is the most involved one. It's Refactor and Re-Architect. Take full benefit of the cloud, and in order to do so, the cloud native services, in order to do so, you have to fundamentally rethink your architecture and therefore rebuild your applications. You may be able to reuse some of it, some of the existing code snippets, the existing business logic, the existing database tables, but you're going to rewire it. You're probably going to break up large applications into smaller pieces. That is a big job. And it's certainly not something that you will do for all your applications at the very start of your cloud migration. But maybe there are some obvious candidates, the ones that you've been struggling with their scalability, for example, or the ability to change them. Maybe those are the ones that you select for this R. For this R, or actually it's a twin of R's, Refactor and Re-Architect. And then the last one, when we started out doing IT in the 90s, there weren't all that many commercial off-the-shelf applications available, these standard business applications that provide out-of-the-box business functionality. But now there are many of them. Many SaaS applications, many offerings that may easily replace your existing custom application. And if your custom application doesn't really need to be custom because it's dealing with a business area that in your organization isn't all that special, perhaps your human resource management or your general ledger or your sales relationship management or order administration, maybe all these processes aren't special. So why would you have a custom application for these? Perhaps probably there are standard applications, SaaS applications that you can use that can replace your existing custom applications. Of course, that doesn't come for free. You will have to migrate data. You will have to change your business process. You will have to retrain people. You will have to create integrations with this new SaaS application. But that might be better than continuing on maintaining your custom application that really should not be a custom application at this stage. The drop and shop, I'm not sure that's an existing expression. I think I came up with it myself and I rather like it. So this is where the commercial off the shelf or the commercial off the cloud applications come in. Of course, you could also take a commercial off the shelf application and run it in the cloud on infrastructure as a service, or even on PaaS as a service, or a platform as a service. It's not entirely the same thing, of course, but it's still a standard application replacing your custom application, reducing the burden on your IT department, on your development teams, allowing them to focus on what really matters. So here's the total overview of 6R in generic terms, not specific to Oracle, not specific to Oracle Database or Oracle Cloud. It's just 6R. What is it? It's retire, it's retain and refurbish, it's rehost, going to the cloud, but to the lowest tier, the fewest changes, or replatform, slightly more changes, refactor, considerably more changes, or repurchase, complete replacement. And of course, there are many things to consider when you are deciding on 6R. And let me stress again that 6R is decided not for your entire landscape at once. It's decided per component, per application, per database. I'll leave this slide to you. I think most of the items on the slides speak for themselves. Of course, you have to consider the business roadmap when you are deciding on 6R. You need to know which things may be retired because they don't map to the business roadmap any longer, etc. So let's talk a little bit. Well, first of all, let's compare the 6R, the 6Rs in their effort, their risk, the agility, the ability to change after you've done the migration for a specific R, and the reduction in total cost of ownership that you might expect. And of course, the reduction in total cost of ownership is extremely high with retire because it goes to zero. The agility and the business, the functional value that you get, of course, is also zero, but that's probably what you want in case of a retirement of a system. Use this in your own evaluation. I think I don't need to discuss the cells. They probably are clear. So the organization I was talking about created this, is it a cartoon or this visualization of the 6Rs? And I've included it for your entertainment, but it also helps to further visualize how Refactor takes you the furthest into the cloud. It's the largest effort that you have to make. It also brings you the most benefits, or at least potentially, whereas retire, well, you can see it on the picture, means that you don't go into the cloud at all. So a few things to remember. 6R is about applications, but it also involves your data, and it involves the platform components and the technical building blocks in your platform. It includes the tools that you have to also modify and adapt to your new cloud environment. And the same goes for your procedures and, of course, your staff. Retraining staff is a very important part of any evolution, but certainly of a migration to the cloud. You should be open to reorganizing your applications and your components. maybe you don't bring everything of an application to the cloud in the same way. Maybe some of it stays on premise and some of it goes to the cloud. In most cases, application is a funny word, and it's a rather arbitrary way of identifying a cluster of features. Not all applications necessarily need to be considered as one single unit, but it is something that you would know better for your organization, of course, than I do. Don't expect to do everything in terms of your cloud migration at the same time. You will have a period of time with a hybrid environment. Maybe it will last for decades, but it will certainly last for years, where some things are on the cloud and other things are on premises, and they need to work together. Even though it's not your end state, it will be an intermediate state. So be aware. Think about how you charge your IT services to the business. In the cloud, you have very fine-grained cost control, as I mentioned before. So you know exactly which resources result in which costs, and you can measure which applications are using these resources, and even which users and business units are using the resources. This deserves a presentation in its own right. Now, it's of course very valuable to know which applications and which existing technology components are used currently, or even if you think they are used and they are installed and they are somewhere in your landscape, are actually not really used, or at least not used to a great degree. And this applies to both applications and to components in your technology platform. So you have your applications, and within your applications you have features, individual components like pages and reports and jobs, and in the past forms. And even though the business and IT management tends to speak in terms of applications, it's actually more correct to speak in terms of these individual features. Applications can be used, but only a few of their features perhaps are used. And many features are not used at all and can easily be retired. So I've been part of migrations where we migrated applications as is, and after the migration, the users came up to us and asked, why the heck did we spend time on migrating reports that they hadn't used for 7 or 8 years? And why the heck did we migrate features that had always been wrong, and after the as-is migration still were wrong? So keep thinking and keep discussing, and don't assume that an application that's being used is used for a good reason or is used in its entirety. So investigate what you have, investigate what is used for applications and their features, but also for data. You may have data that really should be discarded because it's not used anymore. And the same thing goes for the technical components in your technology platform. You may have some libraries flying around, or some database schemas, or even entire databases, but do they actually still need to be there? Here are some of the examples that are part of the technology platform. You may know this picture. It's by Magritte. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. Well, it is a pipe, but it's a picture of a pipe, so it's not really a pipe. And you could say something similar about the Oracle database. This isn't a database. Of course, it is a database, or at least the Oracle database is a database, but what many people do not realize, people not familiar to the world of Oracle, people who may end up in IT management or in business management, and I've met them, they may not realize that the Oracle database is actually much more than a database. It's much more than what they think a database is, because database is a store for data and a SQL engine, but in actual fact, an Oracle database is an application platform. And in most organizations who have used Oracle database for a decade or longer, they have much more in that database than just tables and table records. They have fully fledged applications in their database. And of course, when you think about 6R strategy, it's easy to think that the Oracle database on-premise can easily be replaced with a managed Azure SQL database on Azure. And of course, I've been having this discussion. Or a MySQL database, or a PostgreSQL database. That's usually not true, unless, of course, the Oracle database has been used only for tables and table records and SQL, which most of the cases is not true. Only in those cases is there an easy replacement path. In many cases, there's not. This can be a very hard discussion, by the way, to have. So let's talk a little bit, and I'm running slightly out of time because I was late, of course. My apologies once again. Let's focus on the 6R strategy for Oracle database. What does it look like to apply the 6 R's to the Oracle database? Well, of course, we can retire an Oracle database. That's easy enough. Remove it from your file system, and it's gone. Deinstall, it's gone. You may have to find a proper way of dealing with your data and your backups. Don't forget the backups. But this is basically what you do. Retain and refurbish, the second R in the 6R strategy. Well, the database stays where it is. But you may do things with it. You may consolidate it, or you may break it up. You may upgrade it. You probably should upgrade it. You polish it to make it shine, because now the advanced analytics, spatial, and graph options are free. Maybe you haven't used them in the past, but you can start using them. So retaining doesn't necessarily mean continuing their use in the same way as before. At least think about it. Then rehosting your Oracle database. Rehosting can mean moving it to infrastructure as a service. It could also mean moving to cloud on-premise, or to a different data center for that matter. It could also mean that you don't run Oracle database directly on the operating system, on either bare metal or VM. But you can also run it in a container, for example, on Kubernetes. Is something to consider. It may not buy you any value. You certainly should not do it just because, well, it's Kubernetes and everyone's talking about it. It's something to consider. Replatform for the Oracle database could mean run the Oracle database, a managed Oracle database cloud service, for example, on the AWS RDS. It could also mean run your Oracle database or use the managed Oracle database from Oracle Cloud, the Oracle Autonomous Database. It means stark reduction in your administration effort, your day-to-day operational effort to keep your database healthy, up and running. It also allows you to apply elastic scalability, for example, to your Oracle database. That works in Oracle Cloud. It doesn't work in the other clouds, by the way. So these are the options. You could also take your application and replace the underlying Oracle database with a different database. That's also a form of replatforming. That could be managed SQL on Azure. It could be RDS Postgres, for example, on AWS. It could be managed MySQL on the Oracle Cloud. But of course, you have certain constraints with your application. If your application consists of or has PL SQL in it, it doesn't just work. If you're using Oracle-specific SQL dialect options, like the plus sign for your outer joins, then you will have to rewrite your code in order to allow this replatform to a non-Oracle database. There's the fifth R, the refactoring of your application to use cloud-native facilities. Well, the Oracle database, it might mean that you don't use the Oracle database at all, or not just the Oracle database. So in this picture, I've tried to depict the notion of CQRS, where your Oracle database is your transaction engine. That's where you do data manipulation. That's where the source of truth is for your data. But all the data changes are published to an event bus and are used to create read-only derivative data stores, which could be in MySQL or in a cache or in different platforms. So Refactor Re-Architect does not necessarily mean that you won't use Oracle database, but you will use it in a different way, and you may use different databases alongside the Oracle database. Even NoSQL databases. There I mentioned NoSQL. Of course, when you repurchase applied to your applications, your applications that used to use Oracle database are now replaced by applications that may not use the Oracle database, or for which you can't even see the database because it's hidden in the black box that is your SaaS application. In that case, your Oracle database will vanish. Okay, so the 6 R's applied to Oracle database. These are the options really that you can consider. But even if you're thinking in terms of 6R, even when your trigger is the availability of the cloud, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should go to the cloud, and certainly not that you have to go to the cloud with everything you own. And of course, which is shown in this slide, there are several ways of going to the cloud. Of course, if you do a cloud transformation, you will need to define some of your architecture guidelines, and some areas that you at least should consider in terms of architecture guidelines are on the slide. Since the slides will be available to you, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. These are typically the areas that organizations working on their cloud migration strategy will have their guidelines for. Will have constraints that all steps taken need to satisfy, or if they don't, need to have exemptions for. Of course, you need to be aware of support timelines for your technical components, and this is what it is for the Oracle database. Currently, you should be on 19C. It's the long-term release. 21C is nice for trying things out, for playing along, but it won't be supported for a long time. So 19C is where, for most of your applications, you probably will want to be. And if you're not there yet, you should go there. And that could be your refurbishment strategy as part of Retain. Or if you do rehost or even replatform, this is where you probably want to go. I'm not going to explain this picture in detail, but this is a sort of a selection tree that we created for the customer I was talking about to try to assess for individual applications in their databases what to do with them, where to go to, well, stay on-premise, go to a SaaS application, retire, go to Oracle database on Azure IaaS. Later on, also Oracle Autonomous Database became an option. This is the thought process that for your applications you may want to go through as well, per application, per database, not for your entire landscape at once. So these are some of the steps and some of the considerations for your Oracle database. If you're using any of these features in the Oracle database, remember that these typically will not work in the cloud, will not be allowed in the cloud, and in Oracle Autonomous Database simply aren't available. So these might be things that you have to rework your application for, re-architect, rewrite some code. Now you can make a same consideration, for example, for Oracle SOA Suite. So do your 6R planning for SOA Suite, for other middleware components. I'm not going to go into detail. You probably understand that you can apply 6R to many different components. So here is the an overview of the considerations and different components for that might replace SOA Suite, or the things that you can do with SOA Suite. All right, almost time, so I have to come to my conclusion. 6R is usually triggered by this thought of let's go to the cloud. But even if you're not going to the cloud, please do your 6R evaluation periodically. Look at your applications, look at your technical components, your platform components, and think about their future. What should be their roadmap? As I mentioned, please make your decisions not for your entire landscape. Make them per application, per data set, per technology component, or even per, and probably better, per individual feature or feature area, and not for larger systems, because not everything that you decide will apply to the entire system. Also realize that if you don't decide to make a move, maybe because you don't even think about it, implicitly that's also a decision for which you should have proper arguments and justification. The 6R roadmap is not something that you define only once. It's something that you will continuously define and refine. It's extremely important that you know where you are right now. If you want to know where you're going, you need to know where you start from and what your current situation is. Cloud, of course, is not an easy fix. It certainly has a lot of value and it can help you in different situations. In some situations, it will not help you. In some situations, it will work against you. And it's never trivial to go there. but it's certainly extremely valuable to explore it and also explore the way of thinking and working in a cloud, because some of that might even be applied on premises, like automation, for example. Infrastructure as code is something that you can do with your existing infrastructure by virtualizing it on premises. Realize that many people do not understand that the Oracle database is far more than just a database. And your managers and their managers may have to get a proper introduction of what the Oracle database is to your organization. Realize that you will be, if you go to the cloud, you will be in a hybrid landscape for quite some time, which is fine as long as you realize it. It also means that there will be a lot of network traffic between your cloud environment and your on-premise environment, and cater for that in your designs. I think there's not an excuse for not starting your cloud journey right now, except of course if you're already on your way. And in both cases, I wish you a very safe journey. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you for your patience with me and me being late in the wrong room and making a fool of myself in that way. If you have questions, remarks, complaints, apart from me being late, well, you could complain about that. Here are my contact details, and here are also the contact details for the Rocky Mountain Oracle User Group. And I thank the Rocky Mountain Oracle User Group for having me as a speaker. And I thank all of you for attending the session.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you.